Hello, my name is Ernesto Rodriguez and I am the Alamo curator. Today I am talking to you about the replica 18-pounder project and the 18-pounder Lozoya house exhibit. We're standing here in front of the reproduction 18
close to starting. Microphone start okay? Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the next Alamo Citizens Advisory Committee. The name of this content discussion is Fort Alamo. So welcome to all those too that are watching it live stream. We're excited to be all together. My name is John Kassman. I'm from PGAV. I am privileged to be serving as your facilitator this evening. So after my brief introduction, we're now going to be starting with some, as we often do, some opening remarks from one of our tri-chairs of the ACAC. So I'd like to welcome Sue Ann Pemberton to give a couple opening remarks.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us and welcome. I'm Sue Ann Pemberton, one of the tri-chairs for the Alamo Citizens Advisory Committee. And on behalf of my fellow tri-chairs, Rebecca Villagran and Aranetta Pierce, we welcome you and thank you for being here. I'd also like to recognize Assistant City Manager Lori Houston. Our interpretive and museum consultants, PGAV Destinations, as well as Gallagher and Associates, are also here to listen. As a reminder, a schedule of meetings, a schedule of meetings and the past videos are available on the city's website, and agendas are posted. The next meeting will be on August the 10th to discuss who's who, where, and when. It will be live streamed at 5:30 on the city's YouTube channel. This is our 5th content discussion meeting of the summer. Tonight we'll be learning about Fort Alamo. Why was the Battle of 1836 fought at the Alamo? Why here? Why this specific place? Since its inception, the Alamo has had defenses to protect people inside, first from raiding parties and later from whole armies. These fortifications made the Alamo the perfect place for a small group of men to take a stand against tremendous odds. But Green B. Jameson's modifications were only a part of the Alamo's military history. Stretching from the mission days through the American Civil War, the Alamo has been a defensive place for centuries. I'd like to thank the Alamo Citizens Advisory Committee members who served as theme captains to help plan this meeting. Melissa Killen, Alan Huffines, Forrest Bias, and Matt Brown. Now Forrest Bias will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Bios for our speakers were sent out in advance, and I hope everybody had a chance to look at them. Unfortunately, Colonel Alan Huffines could not join us tonight as planned, but we will continue to benefit from his expertise on this committee. Susan Snow has been an archaeologist for the San Antonio Missions National Historic Park for over 20 years. She served as the coordinator for the San Antonio Missions Quest for UNESCO World Heritage status. The site was formally inscribed in 2015. She has almost 40 years of experience in both historic and prehistoric archaeological sites in the United States and Latin America. And in 2015, she received the Department of the Interior Honor Award for Superior Service. Tonight, she joins us to talk about why the Spanish missions were fortified. Colby Lanham is a history researcher with the Collections and Research Department at the Alamo. He is a veteran of the U.S. Air Force and a 6th-generation Texan. He started working at the Alamo in 2012 and in 2019 was made part of the newly developed collections and research team. Tonight, he joins us to talk about the history of the Alamo cannons and why the Battle of 1836 was fought at this location. Dr. Donald Frazier is the director of the Texas Center at Schreiner University in Kerrville. He has authored 5 books on the Civil War. He is an elected member of the Philosophical Society of Texas, a fellow of the Texas State Historical Association, and a director scholar on the board of the Texas Historical Foundation. Tonight, he joins us to discuss the Alamo's connection to the U.S.-Mexican War. First, we will hear from Melissa Simmons with PGAV Destinations about how tonight's discussion aligns with the vision and guiding principles created by this committee.
Good evening. In our past conversations, we have discussed the Alamo as a home and examined the 2 buildings still standing. We have looked at the Battle of 1836 and the physical and cultural changes that have happened around the San Antonio area since that fateful event. Tonight, we are viewing the Alamo as a fortress and its connection to the military as the site evolved over time. Adjusting our zoom lens so that it looks at the entire site rather than just the church and long barrack as we did previously, we see that there have been many changes over time, each one building upon the last to create the Alamo we see today. But where the walls and embankments once stood, roads and buildings have taken their place. Alamo as a fortress will have to be imagined as we look back in time at maps, descriptions, and drawings to see Fort Alamo through time. 3 guiding principles come to mind as we start our imaginings. First, preservation and interpretation based on historical and archaeological evidence. Evidence is of critical importance as we acknowledge and reflect upon what used to be here, where we are standing now. Today, everyone has access to a camera, and photos and videos can easily show a place over time or even make a 3D scan of a space. Unfortunately, photographs didn't come around until the mid-19th century. Before that, we relied on personal recollections and descriptions, hand drawings, or illustrations to depict places. It is through these records, as well as archaeology, that the historic site of the Alamo is revealed to us today. As we build a clearer picture of the site, we can look at another guiding principle that states balanced scholarship, historical context, folklore, and myth to provide an engaging visitor experience. Not only do we need to draw from historical evidence, but we also need to look at the events that took place at the Alamo to balance facts with dynamic and emotional storytelling. Knowing exactly where a cannon was placed only provides part of the picture. Knowing that that cannon was placed at the southwest corner of the Alamo and fired as a sign of defiance against the incoming Mexican army and Santa Anna's call for no quarter provides a physical setting to a well-known story and takes us back in time to that moment, emotionally and physically. Finally, we look to embrace the continuum of history to foster understanding and healing, as stated in the guiding principles. If we look back at the Alamo for one single event, for example, the Battle of 1836, we see only a moment, frozen and without context, like seeing a single frame of a movie. But if we look at the Alamo across the eras, we can see the evolution of how the fortifications were built and changed over time. These 3 guiding principles can help us to create a multifaceted interpretation of the Alamo's historic site. A great existing example of this is right outside with George Nelson's bronze models showing the Alamo through time. These models use historical evidence to create a 3-dimensional timeline of the Alamo site. Let's take a closer look at a few of them to provide you with some historical context. Probably the most recognized layout of the Alamo is from the Battle of 1836. Showing the fortifications and artillery that eventually fell to the Mexican army. We can see many cannon placed at strategic points around the Alamo, and the central plaza is entirely enclosed by walls, formed by buildings, connecting walls, and earthen embankments. But if we want to truly understand the walls or the buildings, we must go back to 1744 when it was known as Mission de Valero. Here we see a series of homes, some made out of adobe, some out of wood. At the top of the image are the convento and the 2 churches, both the temporary and unfinished ones. The mission was founded on this site just 20 years earlier, and although much progress has been made, there are no walls yet. Fast forward 40 years and we see a more fortified mission with a well-established convento and a more finished church building. The homes along the acequia have become part of the outer wall, yet there is still activity happening outside the walls, such as farming and ranching. A gate has been added to the south to provide security in the form of a small artillery position. While still a very large plaza, the walls make the mission defensible while also acting as a barrier to keep inside new converts who may not be there willingly. In another 20 years, the Spanish military had taken over the former mission, now known as the Alamo, with the 2nd Flying Company stationed here. Old buildings were refitted to become barracks, offices, and storerooms for the garrison. As time moved on, the Spanish company became a Mexican one, and few large-scale changes were made until 1835. This is how the Alamo probably looked right before the Battle of 1836. But these defenses didn't build themselves. During the siege of Bejar in 1835, the Mexican company stationed at the Alamo fortified the old mission into a defensible position. Many of the artillery platforms, ditches, and embankments were built under orders from General Cos, including the ramp in the church, which actually required lowering the back wall in order to have the correct slope for the cannon ramp. Texian Greenby Jameson, a lawyer turned engineer, made a drawing of the Alamo in early 1836 after the Texians had forced the Mexican army to retreat from Bejar. They busily set to work fixing and refortifying the walls, placing even more cannon, and gathering supplies in preparation for a retaliatory attack, which came in February and March of 1836. After the battle, the Mexican army stationed some troops here, and they quickly began rebuilding the fortifications. However, once word was received that Santa Anna had surrendered, their orders were to destroy the Alamo and retreat south. They knocked down walls, disabled cannon, filled in ditches, and pulled up palisades. They also lit a huge fire in the church to destroy the ramp within. This destruction remained as time moved on until the buildings became the quartermaster depot for the American Army after Texas was annexed into the U.S. The existing buildings were retrofitted yet again for the Army's use as offices and storerooms, and by the start of the Civil War, the Alamo was an essential link in the supply chain to the West. The Civil War saw the Alamo change hands to the Confederate Army and back again at the close of the war. By then, the Alamo was the center of San Antonio, and its connection to the military undeniable. Of course, there were even more changes to the Alamo from the 1860s to today, but the fortifications had been absorbed into the city as it grew up, ever closer to the remaining buildings. As we hear more from our experts tonight, we will see how the Alamo's fortifications influenced the history that happened here. And now I'd like to introduce Susan Snow.
Thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. I apologize, I may have to put these on if I can't read what I've got on my paper. It sucks to get old. I must admit to you that I don't consider myself an expert in fortifications, but I hope this brief overview of the complex movement and interaction of various groups in the area of South Texas and northern Mexico is helpful as you talk about and think about the story that you want to tell about the fortifications of the Alamo. So of the 35 or more missions that were established in Texas, the most successful and longest lasting of these, of course, were the 5 that we know here in the San Antonio area. And in order to understand why they were located here and how they endured, we must take a brief look at what this area looked like before the Spanish arrived. So prior to the arrival of the Spanish and the first Spanish explorers, the area of southern Texas consisted of a large number of indigenous groups. And these groups were not locked in their little space in Texas as we might define them on a map. In East Texas, the environment permitted the adoption of the domesticated crops that were introduced from central Mexico along established trading routes and to establish settled agricultural villages. I point this out because it's important to understand that just because a group did not practice agriculture didn't mean they weren't aware of it, but they were using the best adaptation of the environment that they were living in. So the tribes that worked on seasonal rounds and think that somehow they were less civilized or didn't know as much about what was going on as those that were in settled villages. And I think it's important to realize that no, they were masters of their environment and using those resources wisely. Those in other areas of Texas and northern Mexico that didn't provide a lush environment for agriculture, you see seasonal rounds where they're exploiting bison. Yes, bison come all the way into northern Mexico, for those of you who didn't know, and as well as deer, riverine, and coastal resources. Archaeological evidence suggests that these were well-established trade routes, thousands of years old, that went through North America. These traditional trade networks play an important role in the Spanish colonization of this area and the control as we see as we move forward. By the early 16th century, Spanish explorers were crossing parts of Texas, whether purposefully or accidentally, these had two unintended consequences that greatly affect the next stages of colonization. The first is the disease vector that these explorers bring on their expeditions. So even though they may be a small number of people that are only there for a brief time, they are introducing disease that decimates some of these smaller bands and totally changes the social organization that we see pre-Hispanically to those that the missionaries may encounter at the time of the establishment of the missions, because populations were decimated and bands that maybe originally didn't associate with one another had to form groups in order to continue to survive. Now, because of the well-established trade routes, we can't blame it all on these early expeditions, but remember that the traditional trade networks didn't stop just because the Spanish came and colonized, so they were continuing to come up from northern Mexico. So we also have that disease vector that comes in from central Mexico and from the earlier established missions of the Pueblo region. So I'm hoping you're beginning to see what a complicated dynamic this is. And then the second thing that happens with these various Spanish explorers is the introduction of the horse. And the adoption of the horse by particularly the northern tribes changes again how these groups interact with one another and how they will adapt to the changing times that come in colonial times. Okay. So while the earliest missions in modern-day U.S. were in Florida, and they could have affected the San Antonio River Valley, it really is the establishment of these caminos that go up following the traditional trade routes that really begin to affect the area here, particularly the first colonization of the Pueblo region of New Mexico to Santa Fe, because that colonization of that area caused the eastern Apache to have to move out of their traditional territories, and they started to move east. And that all of the different territories start to shift in that time period. So the Camino Real de las Tejas that we think of today is actually a braided series of trails that were originally part of this indigenous trade network and connected various outposts, missions of the territorial government of Coahuila y Tejas. By 1685, we all are familiar with the story of the adventures or misadventures of the French expeditioner La Salle, who accidentally landed in Matagordo Bay and established the short-lived Fort St. Louis. Well, this got the Spanish government to remember that they had a northern part of New Spain and that perhaps they should do something to keep control of it. So they established two missions in East Texas in 1690. And while these were short-lived, the Spanish government revisited the idea of protecting their eastern border with French territory and began to establish missions in East Texas again in 1716. So part of this new strategy of protecting East Texas was the establishment of a way station between Mexico City and the eastern border. So in 1718, they established Mission San Antonio de Valero the Presidio de Bejar, and the Villa de Bejar. This is a bit of a change from the original sort of purpose of holding territory that the Spanish talked about, and that it usually was all about holding the territory right there and converting the people of that area, not so much of establishing a way station along the longer trade route. So already the significance of San Antonio de Valero is beyond a traditional mission from the beginning of its establishment. So the Presidio de Bejar is established at the same time, but in 1721, the Marquis de Aguayo expedition comes through San Antonio to take a look again at how the East Texas missions were doing. And when he saw that all that had preceded in the Presidio was some thatched huts, he decided that there needed to be something done. It was a fire hazard, it was a disease hazard in this low-lying area. So he moved the location to the higher ground that we know of today as the Presidio, and he developed that beautiful model of Presidio that we see on the left-hand side, and planned to do a complete fortification. And they began to change some of the structures into adobe structures. As you'll see on the map on the right, the Presidio never really made that fortified structure that was the plan. So when San Antonio de Valero was established, they brought some of the neophytes from San Juan Baptista on the Rio, from the Rio Grande Valley that was having trouble maintaining their establishment to help establish this mission. But in 1720, Father Margil, who'd been instrumental in establishing the East Texas missions, declared that San Antonio de Valero was not properly serving all of the bands of the San Antonio River Valley. And so he got permission to deviate from the law of the Indies to establish Mission San Jose y San Miguel de Aguayo. They claimed it was the right number of leagues away if you followed the curves of the river instead of going straight, but I don't think we're 7 miles from San Jose at this point. So he was able to establish that. The documents do confirm that one of the reasons was that the different bands that were coming into this area by choice or by force or by desperation due to climate change and other things that were happening at the time didn't always want to be in the same mission together. And so there were some logical reasons for establishing this second mission. These traditional bands continued to be under pressure from the beginning of these establishment of San Antonio de Valero and San Jose, with raids from the Lipan Apache that were moving into this area from the west, which provided at least initial incentive for the bands to come into the missions. So by 1731, we add another, and sorry I'm giving you like the 30,000 Reader's Digest view of some of these things. There's not time to do it all. Three of the East Texas missions were moved to the San Antonio River Valley because pressure from France was waning, and they decided to close the Presidio Dolores and the East Texas. So they brought the missions that we now know today as Concepcion, Espada, and San Juan onto the San Antonio River. And even though they were late to the game, all 5 missions were sort of at the same stage of development as we look at the 1740 to 1750s time period. And we saw just earlier the illustration of that time period for what the Alamo looked like, or San Antonio de Valero, and you can see 3 of the other mission layouts from that same time period looking very similar, where they were more of a village street layout and not a fortified system, even though we know that they were dealing with raids from the Apache at that time. In 1749, something important happens, and that's the treaty between Spain and the Lipan Apache. While we know that aggression from the Apache doesn't just stop that day and they never raid again, we still have lots of reports of rustling from the ranchos and different things. But it did change the Spanish attitude toward the Lipan Apache, and it increased the aggression by the Comanche, Tonko, and the Caddo, who were mad at the Lipan Apache for forming this treaty with Spain. So in 1749, there was the establishment of Mission San Saba and the Presidio San Saba, to protect the Lipan Apache, and that's in Menard, for those of you who may not be familiar where that is located. And this is a really pivotal moment for us in the San Antonio River Valley, because shortly after the establishment of the Presidio and the mission, in 1758, a group of Comanche, Tonkawa, and other northern tribes attacked and burned the young mission San Saba that was still wooden structures. And this completely destroyed the mission. Even this had a profound effect on what happens next in our area. So shortly after that, the second action that really affects how the San Antonio missions develop is Marquis de Ruby's inspection of the Texas missions of 1767. He is ordered to examine all of the missions of northern New Spain and evaluate their success, and he recommends after that that all of the missions and presidios in Texas be abandoned except for those along the San Antonio River, and that includes La Bahia as well in Goliad. But so after 1760, you see a change in what's happening in the construction at all 5 of the missions. After 1760, they begin to change the indigenous quarters from streets to fortified perimeter. There's many reports of inadequate support from the Presidio de Bejar. In fact, there are reports where they call out particularly to Mission San Jose, which had the largest indigenous militia with up to 103 armed men at a time, to come and help because they didn't have enough soldiers at the Presidio to go and help to fight in other areas of South Texas. Then, due to these changing pressures from the Comanches, by 1780, the instructions for new missions include a perimeter wall, and by 1780, all 5 of the San Antonio missions, as well as Espiritu Santo further south, are described as having walled compounds. So the other phenomenon, I better talk a little bit faster, that happens after this fortification of the missions is, the Franciscans of the College of Querétaro are ordered to move west to fill the missions that were left by the friars after the Jesuits are expelled in 1767. And you begin to see, particularly after 1772, you start to see a little bit of lament from the priests about how there aren't as many neophytes and the missions seem to be declining. But what I see in the archaeological and architectural record is the churches are completed, the perimeter walls expanded, if anything, we have a growth period of construction. And what the records tell us is that there are more non-indigenous people living in the missions. There seems to be a bit of a breaking down of those distinctions between indigenous and mestizo and Spanish, and you don't have a separation as much between the Villa and the missions. And frankly, when the villagers in Bejar are under threat, they don't go to the Presidio because it still doesn't have any fortifications. They come to San Antonio de Valero for protection because it's a fortified site. And at Rancho de los Cabras, the map that you see on the left, we actually see an expanded perimeter and a chapel added in this time period, which my theory is, and Christy can agree or disagree with me on that one, but is that it became a fortification for the private ranchers along the San Antonio River in the late 18th century to protect them from an increasingly unstable area. All right, finally, in 1794, the San Antonio de Valero was completely secularized, and the other 4 southern missions were partially secularized. Residents of the missions were given a portion of the lands, and including those non-Indians that had lived there at the time. The missions continued to serve, in addition to San Antonio de Valero, they continued to serve as fortifications, perhaps even into the Mexican period. We know as late as 1813, Mission Espada and Mission Concepcion were used as rest areas for the Republican Army after the Battle of Rocio, and it is during the Mexican period that Americans and Anglos fees keep coming in. The bastion at Mission Espada actually is built during this Mexican period or the late colonial period as part of those fortifications. And then just to summarize, because I don't know where I am on the time, but I think I'm running out. The last thing I want to talk about is that not only did the fortified mission design become the standard for Texas, you may have called the Texas mission design, it plays an important role in the rest of the expansion of the Spanish colonial area because the missionaries take the Texas design as they continue to settle up the coast of California, and influence the colonial development of that region. Thank you very much. So, wait, I have to show my table.
All right, that was a very good job. It's going to be very difficult to follow up with that. I appreciate your time and allowing me to be here tonight. I wanted to start off with an image that's pretty powerful that we use here from time to time. It's part of the Alamo collection, and it kind of helps to discuss our topic. Why here? Why at the Alamo? And then why is the artillery here? And why is it so important? When visitors come to the Alamo, a lot of the times they're talking about the who. Who's here? Why they're here? And what brought them to Texas? But a lot of times when we look at the artillery that's involved, everyone's like, well, that's a Texas cannon, right? Texans had control of the fort, so it must be Texan. And through our research, about 2 years' worth now, we've discovered that not only are none of the cannons present at the Battle of the Alamo minted or made in Texas, there's only one that we know of that's actually even made in Mexico. And so it brings about a very interesting topic of the Alamo. Yes, it's a very Texan story. And very Texan-centric, but it's also, you have individuals from all over the world. And so just like the Alamo defenders from all over the place, so are the cannon. So this image obviously shows the morning of March 6, 1836. It's by Gary Zaboli. And in the background, you'll see a piece of artillery, the famous 18-pounder. This cannon that Melissa mentioned in her opening remarks is known throughout Texas history is probably the most famous cannon involved at the battle. This 18-pounder was thought to be English for around 50 or 60 years. There's a lot of research backing that. And what we found out was not only is it not English, it's from a country that a lot of people don't connect with Texas. And that would be Sweden. Our research determined that the Alamo's 18-pounder, this famous gun, not only wasn't an 18-pounder at all, it was a 9-pounder that was bored out to accommodate a larger round, but it was not made in England, it was made in Sweden. And this lithograph shows the actual foundry, it's from 1820, where the cannon was cast. What takes place for most of Europe at this time period is that England is the mass producer of all artillery, and they are selling it to anyone, everyone that wants to buy it. The issue is that they end up having to fight most of those people, so they're facing their own artillery on the field of battle and on the high seas. It's a little bit of an issue. So England says no more exporting. So that leaves a power vacuum. And a country steps up in the form of Sweden, and they bring in Dutch merchants who are very wealthy, and they extract the iron ore that is prevalent in Sweden, and they start to cast these very large guns, and they're using an English design. But what they do is they perfect it. So for many years, they thought the 18-pounder was indeed English. They would take the iron, they would melt it down, they would pour it into an empty cast, hence the name cast iron, and then they would end up with a solid bronze or iron gun, depending on the gunmetal used. You can see here gunsmiths actually taking that solid gun and putting it on a lathe. Took 4 or 5 men to do this. The cannon barrel in question there looks like about an 18-pounder, which weighed 1,000 to 1,500 pounds. Solid iron, and it's turned onto a giant drill bit. They would first start very small, and they would start spinning, and they would ream that out to accommodate the equivalent round, whether it be a 6-pounder, meaning the weight of the ball, or a 12 or an 18. Once that's done, they would then sell it to whatever military was interested in buying their guns. This meant that most of Europe is carrying Swedish artillery into battle, not only on the field of battle throughout Europe, but also into their royal navies. Sweden does so well in this, in fact, they're not just selling to the military powers of Europe, they're actually selling to commercial merchants. Merchants at this time period actually would pay less duty or tax at port if they had cannons on their ship. You could protect your goods, and you could carry it across to the New World or throughout Europe. And if you had cannons on there, your taxes were less. So Sweden's selling these cannons to anyone and everyone. And some of them end up in Texas. This map shows San Antonio. Yes, it's very small, but it's smack dab in the middle. And if you were to zoom in a little bit, you would actually see there are 5 or 6 different roads merging on to San Antonio de Bejar. A lot of these cannons are coming in from the coast. They're coming in on private merchant vessels, and the Mexican Army is actually going to take some of the cannon from the missions that Susan talked about that are closing down, and they're going to bring them and concentrate them in this far-flung Mexican territory. By March 31st of 1835, the Mexican government passes the Militia Reduction Act, which means that all the guns and all the cannons may be put into central locations. That's part of the reason why the Alamo is chosen as a site for battle. The cannons of the Alamo, there are 24 of them that are brought here. That's the largest concentration of artillery west of the Mississippi at the time. So there are a lot of cannons and firearms centralized here. And part of that would be these roads and trade and commerce that comes through here, but also all things diplomatic and the military. So you have this fort, you have a ton of artillery, and it's playing a pretty vital role in protecting the Mexican assets in this area. You can see this map by Sanchez Navarro showing the Alamo and its fortifications. The outer walls are lined with cannon. Again, there are 24 of them. Most of them are on carriages. We do know through the Bexar County Archives that there were not enough carriages for every cannon. Some of them were on makeshift cotton wagons. They would use a cotton wagon axle, or they were even just placed on a spinning platform. So they're using anything and everything they can to mount these pieces of artillery. On the morning of March 6th, and prior to that, actually, February 23rd to March 6th, the cannons will be used in defiance, of course, of the Mexican Army. The Mexican Army will also be firing their artillery, and they'll be doing that constantly. They'll be shelling the fort with howitzers, mortars, and round shot or solid shot cannons, cannonballs. And there's some short miracle that takes place there. Not a single Texan is killed during that 12-day siege. But on the morning of March 6th, of course, these cannons are going to be used in a pretty dramatic effect to deal with certain portions of the fort. Unfortunately for the Texans, those cannons on the carriages that they're on were difficult to maneuver. They weighed a lot. And the angle that they were sitting on top of the walls made it very difficult to fire down on the advancing Mexican army. So even though the Texans had the benefit of the artillery, they lacked the appropriate angles. The carriages were not helping them at all. And furthermore, the Texans weren't really trained to function with this artillery. So you have a couple things working against the Texans when they should have actually been able to employ this artillery to really effective use. So after the battle's over with, the Mexican army is going to round up the artillery. They're going to put it, leave it on display until April 21st, whenever the Mexican army loses the Battle of San Jacinto. So they're going to eventually get an order to take all the cannons off the outer walls, disable them, and take the ones that are on good carriages with you and leave. That's exactly what happens. The Mexican army knocks all of the trunnions, which would hold it onto the carriage. They would spike them by shoving something in the muzzle, and they would bury all of the guns in the defensive trenches. You fast forward to the 1850s, a man by the name of Samuel Maverick is building a fence for his wife, and he finds 13 cannons in his front yard. These cannons are going to be dispersed throughout San Antonio. Some of them, the bronze content, they'll make bells and things of that nature out of them for the churches, and then the rest of the iron ones will be buried. This is showing them in 1904, I believe, or 1909, in Fisher's Drugstore, where the Gibbs Hotel now sits. All of the cannons in that picture are currently in the Alamo collection. We're lucky enough to have 9 of the original 24 guns in our collection. The famous 18-pounder is also found by a couple of soldiers who are told by the local residents that there's treasure hidden in the muzzle of the gun. They go about sawing on it for 2 days, hitting it with hammers and rope until they break the muzzle of the cannon off and there's nothing inside, unfortunately for them. The cannon is then taken to San Pedro Springs Park and put on a plinth for display. You can see it there on the left, and then it actually disappears around 1917. We never see it again. So what the Alamo is doing now currently is we're trying to replicate the Alamo artillery. We're putting it back on the battlefield to allow individuals to come, see our site, and get an idea of the role the Alamo artillery played, and also get a size and scale for the massive footprint that the Alamo once had. And we have 3 of the original cannons reproduced currently. The Alamo 18-pounder is in place on a platform on the southwest corner. And we're working on a small bronze gun, and then we'll eventually have 11 cannons put back on the battlefield. The Alamo artillery is one of the main reasons why the battle takes place here. Goliad, as Susan mentioned, is also a key point. They have a number of guns as well. The artillery plays a vital role in the story of Texas, but is still helping to play a vital role in the history and the story of the Alamo today. Thank you for your time.
I wish I could grow that epic a mustache. Just saying. All right. What we're going to talk about now is the Alamo after the battle. So this is an issue or an illustration showing kind of what the pile looks like after the battle and into the 1850s. But I want to introduce you to a concept that I ran into in the city of Delphi, high in the mountains of Greece. Delphi was a sacred quarter. Of course, they had the Oracle of Delphi, and the Oracle of Delphi was sniffing volcanic vapors and giving pronouncements. There was all sorts of treasuries from the various city-states in Delphi. The importance of that region, though, was so profound that the ancient Greeks declared it the navel of the world. It was the absolute birthplace of all civilization, or certainly the most important place. We run into this same concept with places like Jerusalem or Rome, or even Mexico City. For our purposes, the Alamo is the navel of the Texas world. Now, clearly you could see from the illustration that the navel of the world is an Audi, but Bear is the navel of Texas in terms of its importance. It is the center of gravity because it, as has been alluded to before, is the crossroads between the coast, the Rio Grande, and El Norte, the great northern mystery, the big stretches between here and oblivion. In this story, mileage is everything. From Bear, it's 1 or 2 weeks to anywhere, to the coast, to the Rio Grande, up north to Presidio San Saba, which was described earlier. That's the radius. That's the 150-mile radius. And it is absolutely the epicenter. So strategically, this is important acreage to occupy. And we've talked about that in the context of the battle, but now that the battle's over, the fighting's over, the frontier has moved, who cares? Why is San Antonio maintaining its strategic importance? Because it is centrally located. When the United States annexes Texas, and some would argue Texas annexed the United States simultaneously, they had to figure out what exactly was the right real estate to occupy. You know, this is terra incognita to most Americans. This is the far stretches, the far reaches. So they send a couple of companies from up in the Chickasaw Nation Indian Territory to come down and essentially occupy San Antonio. We're now going to quit referring to it as Bear, and we're going to refer to it as San Antonio because that becomes the American vernacular. When they get here, when these troops get here, they're quartered all over town. Their gear is strewn all over town. I don't know if you know much about 18 to 24-year-olds, which is the military age male. They tend to dribble gear, and there is no central place to actually accumulate all this stuff. And so one of the things that the officers start looking for is, hey, do we got any real estate we can annex that we can use as kind of a central gathering point? So ultimately it gets leased, the Alamo gets leased to the Army. Of course, in order to keep your supplies dry, you have to build a roof. All right, so I won't go through the ins and outs of this document. I'm assuming that these documents will be available after the fact. But the idea is, hey, we have to find a place that we can use for storage and as utility space. We essentially need barns, we need stuff to keep things out of the weather, and we need places that have limited access. A bunch of the United States Army gear was walking, and it was walking because you could get to it. You know, if you're essentially leasing somebody's private home, probably had a front door and a back door. And so you had some corporal out front watching the gear. Meanwhile, somebody's coming in through the back door saying, hey, I'll buy that, box of bandits, and somebody's cutting back deals. So there's some security issues that lead to the need to have a centralized location. Plus, they're also talking about the threat of the indigenous peoples. They said there's Indians prowling about, they'll steal stuff, and then also ladrones, good old-fashioned thieves. So what happens is, once they lease the Alamo, they say, now we've got some warehouse space. This is not sexy real estate. This is the bus barn for the independent school district, in essence. This is the utility sheds. This is where you put the road graders and all that sort of stuff. This is not where you put the high-ranking officers' quarters. This is where you put the guys that are the artificers, that are creating things, fixing things, and accumulating the materials of war. But they've got to roof the place. They've got some really nice walls in the chapel, or the church, sorry, almost cardinal sin there. But they have to put a roof on it. So what's interesting is here's what it costs to put the roof on the church. That's an awful lot of shingles that they're accumulating. 500 pounds of nails. You can see what the appropriation is. So these guys are putting a very fine pencil on the Alamo in order to get it up to speed. Once you have this utility area secured, and once you have it in good working order, this becomes an extraordinarily useful staging area for campaigns that are waged in northern Mexico. The first expedition, I think, that left here, or accumulated here and left from San Antonio, certainly is Captain Addison Gillespie's occupation of the city of Laredo. So he's heading down the Laredo Road and occupying Laredo and trying to bring that border city, border town at that time, into the orbit of Texas. Because throughout the Republic period, Laredo was pretty much a free state in and of itself. The largest expedition out of the Alamo area, but San Antonio proper, is General Wool's expedition, about 3,000 troops. Their plan was to actually head down to the Rio Grande, cross near present-day Eagle Pass, and then head southwest towards Chihuahua, where they would link up with an expedition coming out of Missouri, overland on the Santa Fe and Chihuahua Trail under Alexander Doniphan. Once they get into northern Mexico, Doniphan's having a pretty easy time of it, so word comes to Wool, hook a left and head down towards Zachary Taylor's army, and your guys will reinforce that army when we take some troops from Zachary Taylor's army and send them elsewhere down into the Central Valley of Mexico. So these guys, that's the expedition, about 3,000 men. There's a regular battery of U.S. artillery. There's 5 companies of dragoons from the 1st and 2nd U.S. Dragoons, 3 companies of infantry, a couple of Illinois volunteer regiments, and an Arkansas regiment. Probably the first large accumulation of tourists from Illinois and Arkansas at the Alamo. So the Mexican War is fought. The Mexican War ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Now, what purpose could the Alamo possibly serve? Is it still the navel of South Texas? Turns out it is. Because now that you have this new annexation, the Mexican cession, one of the articles of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that is often read past is that Mexico ceded all responsibilities for all the indigenous peoples in the Mexican cession to the United States. So guess what? It's the clause that we like to refer to, you broke it, you own it. And so now the United States has to figure out, how do we get these people that have been for generations raiding into Mexico to stay on this side of this new border? And that's going to take a frontier constabulary. A frontier constabulary is going to need beans and bullets and saddles and harness and tack. And you got to store it somewhere. So the Army says, look, we've already got these facilities rented. We put a roof back up on the chapel. We got this really cool sort of false front we put up on it, very stylish, we think. So why don't we just keep doing what we're doing right here? And that's what they do. Because once again, it's centrally located to everything. That dark blue line marks roughly the limit of the supply chain between the northern forts on the Texas frontier and the southern forts on the Texas frontier. So you cannot talk about the Texas forts without talking about the Alamo. And the reason being is that anything that's going out to those forts, from a can of smoked oysters to a horseshoe, is starting out in Indianola on the coast, going over here, being inventoried. They're taking a look to see, what kind of melted on the trip, what disappeared, and then once it's repackaged, it's then allocated to the various frontier posts. So this is central receiving and shipping for the entire Texas line of forts. So the Alamo in the 1850s is a story of it's a very mundane story, but anybody that's ever been in any sort of business context understands, the guys that work the warehouse are pretty doggone important to the overall well-being of your operation. Some more quotes about how come this is an important place that we need to maintain. But I like that phrase right there. It's the most central and convenient to all other posts. You can get there from here, and that's important. We're the hub. So now we're getting into the 1850s look of the fortress. And now it's more of a Fort Sam Houston fort than it is a castle or a four-walled fortification. It is a collection of government buildings that have secure entry and exit, but it is not really built for defensive purposes. This is not a fortified position. This is a place where you back a wagon up to the main door of the church and you load it up with provisions. Really, very mundane. It's a logistics hub. So once again, we've got another report on what's going on at the Alamo. And again, this is an important place. But they don't sugarcoat what kind of place the Alamo is. They say, it's an extensive pile. This is not deluxe circumstances. This is, we got some old buildings that are kind of chipped and broken, but they'll do. Frederick Law Olmsted, one of the most fascinating figures from this time period, later on is famous for designing Central Park in New York City, had a habit of going through southern states to write about the condition of slavery in those states. He was very, very critical. And so he does a trip through the southern coastal states and finally makes his trip to Texas, a saddle trip through Texas. And mostly he doesn't like Texas. Shock of all shocks. Sometimes we're hard to love. But one of the things that he does point out was that this pile of junk and rubble and kind of beat up, scarred rock is important, and he uses the phrase, the heroic defense of Travis and his handful of men in 36. It has been a monument, not so much to faith as to courage. So here's a guy who doesn't like Texas. Oh, he likes the Germans in Texas. He likes those guys because they have nice rock walls and their houses are tidy and things like that. It's the redneck crackers he doesn't like. This is the guy that takes a look at the Alamo and says, you know what? It doesn't look like much, but my gosh, is it important. So once again, we've got a quartermaster report that you can read at your leisure elsewhere. Actually, these are all excerpts from a book we're going to publish through State House Press in the fall called Queen of the West, which is a documentary history of San Antonio. But essentially gives you an idea of what all the functions are and what it actually looks like and who gets to sit in what office. And it's really the nuts and bolts of the place. Now, the Alamo and the Civil War. Usually everybody points out, wait, that Texas flag is upside down. You know, it's not until the 20th century that we standardized the state flag. So you had people putting the star akimbo one way or the other, red stripe over white stripe. There is no rule. But this is an engraving of the actual takeover of the government property in San Antonio by the rebellious forces of the state of Texas, not even yet Confederate. And that's them down on the main Civic Plaza. Pretty famous works out of the contemporary journalism of the time. And I'll leave you with this last really good-looking fella. I think that is perhaps the most awesome Civil War-looking generosity guy that I can find. It's a really well-preserved photograph from the Library of Congress. Sibley, Henry Hopkins Sibley, is a native of Natchitoches, Louisiana, veteran of the old Army, and he sells the new Confederate government an idea that you can invade New Mexico on a self-sufficient campaign and it won't cost the government anything. Where does he launch that expedition into New Mexico? Where does he take the idea of American Manifest Destiny and turn it into Confederate Manifest Destiny? Where is the ignition point? Right out there in the plaza. Once again, the Alamo is the center of the world. Thank you.
One last thank you to all three of you for the wonderful presentations. The good news and bad news is you're not off the hook yet. We're going to take a short break and then we're going to come back with panel discussions. So for us here in person, we're going to take a short break, reconvene in about 10 minutes. However, for those of you joining in the live stream on YouTube, we're going to have a couple short videos that are provided by the Alamo while you wait. And again, sit tight. We'll be back on the live stream in approximately 10 minutes. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ernesto Rodriguez and I am the Alamo Curator. Today I am talking to you about the replica 18-pounder project and the 18-pounder Lozoya House exhibit. We're standing here in front of the reproduction 18-pounder. The cannon was made in Ohio by the Verdun Bell Company. They were the ones we chose because they could manufacture something of this scale. The carriage was made by Hanson Wheel and Wagon out of South Dakota. So with those two companies combined, they were able to produce the cannon that you see behind me today. So in producing this cannon, what we ended up doing was going to the archival record. Unfortunately, not a lot of information was actually known about the cannon, so we went looking at photographs. We found a photograph from the front of the church with the cannon in the ground, and then we found several where it was once housed at San Pedro Springs Park. We took those images and we found the plinth that it once laid at, and we measured that, found out how tall the gentleman in one of the photos was, and we were able to use a company to produce the scale that we have today. With the information already retrieved, we then found out that this cannon, the 18-pounder, the most iconic cannon at the Alamo, was actually a bored-out 9-pounder. So they had been in use for many, many years. And it was bored out prior to the battle in order for it to fire an 18-pound cannonball. That is one of those interesting things about the Alamo artillery, is that many of them were reused older pieces. The exhibit opens on Friday, April 16th and runs for about 18 months. It will be open during regular business hours. This new exhibit will allow us to be able to interpret the plaza better and let people know that once they walk up onto this area, front of Riverwalk, they are in the Alamo complex, something that we have not been able to do so far.
Hello, my name is Colby Lanham. I'm with the Historical and Research Department at the Alamo. I'm here with Doug Hansen, the creator and the owner of Hansen Wheel and Wagon. What you see behind Doug here and myself is the 18-pounder. It's finally been realized. This is about a year and some change worth research and work. What we discovered through our research is that the 18-pounder, once it's disabled by the Mexican Army after the Battle of the Alamo on March 6th, it's discarded. And it's found later on in the 1850s by a handful of men. They end up damaging the cannon, being told that there was treasure inside the muzzle of the gun. And once they realize that's not the case, it's kind of tossed aside. And later on, it disappears after being in San Pedro Springs Park for a number of years. That's kind of where the story picks up for us. This cannon barrel was made by Verdon Bell and Clock out of Cincinnati, Ohio. Then we shipped it out here to South Dakota, and it came into the hands of Doug Hansen and his team. And something that we kind of posed to them was, through our historical research with some of the leading Alamo experts on cannon carriages of this type, we found out that the carriage the 18-pounder sat on was likely a makeshift carriage of some sort, likely made by the Alamo garrison during the 12-day siege, February 23rd to March 5th. And so what we posed to Doug and his team was making a somewhat rough-hewn cannon carriage that was not painted, not fully finished, and kind of an amalgamation of parts that the Alamo defenders would have had on them at the time.
You know, as you recited your research to us, that gave us the insight. Okay, now, here the Alamo comes up with a cannon barrel, and through a process of resourcefulness, they were able to put together the cannon carriage. This is a model that's just assembled out of the inventive nature of the craftsman to fit the barrel. So we utilized obviously some very heavy timber in the cannon carriage, and fitted it and balanced it to the size of the cannon, and didn't try to define it as a model, like a specific model of cannon. It was just something to be put together as a utilitarian piece.
If you want to come see the exhibit and you're wondering how long this would be open, it's open for about 18 months. It is a temporary exhibit and we open during our normal operation hours. We're very excited about this exhibit because it's the first of its size and scale in Alamo Plaza. We're also excited from a historic standpoint. This gives visitors a great idea of what this corner of the Alamo looked like in 1836, but it also explains why the artillery was so important to the Alamo story.
The Battle of the Alamo happens within a larger Mexican Civil War, which starts out soon after Mexican independence. Following Mexican independence from Spain in 1821, the country was dealing with what kind of government to establish. They could establish a monarchy, a centralist government, or a federalist republic. The first choice became a monarchy under Agustin I. That was short-lived, and it led to the Federalist Constitution of 1824 after a lot of arguing. With the Federalist Constitution, the centralist authorities that wanted to centralize all authority in Mexico City were dealt a blow. This was going to be short-lived. In 1829, there's a coup led by Anastasio Bustamante, which leads for other states in the Mexican Republic to begin to fight for their rights. In 1832, this leads to Santa Anna's rising up once again and his being elected the following year. With his election, Texas support, he now has a federalist government to oversee. He soon becomes basically bored, leaves the government in the hands of his vice president, and goes back to his estate. While at his estate, his Vice President Valentin Gomez Farias changes the laws of Mexico, and they affect the three major groups that would get you elected: the military, the landowners, and the church. They go to Santa Ana and they say, hey, we don't like the changes that are happening. And so Santa Ana says, basically, I will take care of this. And he goes back and regains control of the government using a clause in the Constitution which gives the president basically more authority during times of crisis. So he comes into power, he deposes the federalist government, puts his centralist friends in, and centralizes all authority in Mexico City. States lose their rights, they become basically departments in Mexico, and this leads to a civil war in Mexico. Among the states fighting were Zacatecas and Coahuila y Texas. Now, as this is occurring, there is a plan to start a revolt with more states led by Farias, General Mejia, and Lorenzo de Zavala. Unfortunately, the Mejia side, which was the strong arm, the military force, is defeated, and it leads to Texas basically standing alone. They are still fighting early on for the restoring of the Federalist Constitution of 1824. But that will soon change. The war party in Texas begins to gain more and more momentum. And following the Battle of Bear, they are truly now in control. The Battle of Bear leads to the taking of the Alamo for the first time by the Texian army. And this prompts the Texas government to see that there's the opportunity for advancing the idea of a republic. They will form committees and conventions.
If you could all find your seats, please. Everybody find their seats, please. Thanks everybody for returning. Taking a good 10-minute break. We've gotten organized. Our speakers are here and ready to start kind of our second chapter of our discussion. And so we have a handful of questions to moderate a nice panel discussion now. And to moderate that, I'm going to welcome ACAC member Matt Brown to moderate. Thank you.
Way to go. Woo! All right. All right, ready to go? You can hear me, right? Tall guy, I don't have to lean over. Hi, that was awesome. I'm like all my history brain synapses are starting to fire again. Like I was back to college. I'm like, man, hope there's not a test after this. So I got 3 questions. Let's see, 1, 2 for you, 2 for you, and then I'm gonna toss one in at the end. And we can totally, let her rip. So if another one comes up while I'm asking questions, get on a card, make a paper airplane, throw it at me. I'm pretty good at catching those. So here we go. Susan, you ready to go? Fire away. Okay. So could you speak to the Indian/neophyte militias?
Sure. So when each of the missions was originally assigned 2 to 4 soldiers from the Presidio that were supposed to help protect the missions. And 2 to 4 soldiers doesn't sound like very many, and oftentimes those soldiers would be taken away by the Presidio to go do something somewhere else. And so each of the missions was instructed to have their own protection force. And remember, we're not talking about inexperienced warriors here, or militia. These are very advanced bow and arrow hunters, and in fact, I always tell people, I'd be much more worried about somebody with a bow and arrow than with a musket, because the bow and arrow was a lot more accurate than a musket, and they could fire it faster. So San Jose had the largest of these militias. It also had the largest population of any of the missions, and they had 50 regulars, they called them, but they had enough weaponry for up to 103 of the men to be armed and ready to go. Brad Jones, actually, at the Texas Historic Commission, has been doing some work at the Presidio, where he's found documents that say they were calling up, so to speak, the mission sites to get these Indian militias to come help them when they're being called out to other parts of South Texas, especially when you're looking at the Lepon Apache and some of the cattle rustling and things that were happening. I think that's it that I have to say.
And how effective were they? I mean, how were they actually being utilized, and how effective were they?
That I don't know that I have a really great answer for you in terms of how were they being utilized. They were being sent to go out just like the regular soldiers. And remember, that's one of the other things that I think we don't think about. When we think of the Presidio soldiers, we think of Spanish soldiers. But what are they really? They are mestizos. They are indigenous from other parts of Mexico. And one of the things that I remember listening to Brad Jones give a talk where he said, we used to talk about how all of the gun flints must have been made by indigenous for the soldiers. It's like, oh yeah, they had so many people, they could have somebody sitting behind working out their gun flints while they were going ahead and loading their musket. No, so each of the individual soldiers, whether they were coming up from Oaxaca and joining the Presidio, or whether they were being brought in from the missions, they all had to be competent to maintain their own weapons and to handle themselves. And at San Jose anyway, they talk about they practiced every day marching in the compound in formation, so they were ready to go.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
And for the person who asked that question, do you have a follow-up to that? Did you get what you want? Did you learn what you wanted to learn? Yeah, good? All right. Thank you. I can barely see that thumbs up over there. All right. Hey, Colby. So we have some Canon geeks that have some questions for you. So how many men did it take to fire one cannon? And what were the ranges and the types of shot that were used?
Great question. It really depends on the size of the cannon being used. The Alamo will have everything from a 1-pounder that would fire a small cannonball the size of a golf ball, all the way to the 18-pounder, which weighed 18 pounds and was roughly 5.5 to 5.9 inches wide. And so it really just depended on what their ask me the first question again. I apologize.
So how many men did it take to fire?
Oh, sorry, yeah. So it depends on the size of the gun. The 1-pounder could be used by an individual who could load and fire it like a musket, but the larger cannon, like the 18-pounder, would need anywhere from 9 to 12 people to function that cannon properly, which is an issue on the morning of March 6th. I kind of alluded to that in my talk, that you don't have enough men to man the walls, much less enough men to fire the cannon. So that is problematic. So anywhere from 9 to 12, or you could have one man loading and firing a small muzzle-loading gun that would fire a golf ball.
And was the shot all made out of the same material, or were they using, were they loading it with just anything that they could get at some point?
Yeah, so that's another good portion to that, is that standard armies would use what's called a solid shot, which is a solid spherical ball, usually made out of iron, but for the Mexican army, they didn't have a lot of iron, so they would use bronze or brass or even lead, and even rocks. All armies would use whatever they had, and if they didn't have enough of that, they would actually use what's called Lagrange, which would be any metal object you could use to chop up and throw inside the cannon, and it would essentially become a large shotgun. And I know whenever I tell people that, they think, well, that couldn't be very effective. But the 18-pounder is moving the same speed as the cannonball once it's fired, is moving the same speed as a 9mm handgun round. Okay, and it's going to hit you with about the same amount of energy as shoving a Volkswagen Beetle off of a 20-story building. And so if a spoon is going 600 miles an hour or a horseshoe, it's going to be just as effective as a cannonball. So there was use of Lagrange, and then, of course, what they call canister or grape shot, which would be small lead, usually, or iron balls, a few, maybe 60 to 100 of them inside of almost like a can or a sack, and it'd be fired off and effectively become a shotgun. And it is implemented here at the Alamo. And then we have some evidence that even heated shot was used here, which is where you take an iron ball, you warm it till it's red hot, you fire it in hopes that you could hit the enemy's powder store and cause their cannons to explode. So, yeah, it's anything and everything that can be put inside that cannon is going to be used.
Wow. Yep. All right. Sounds dangerous.
Very dangerous.
That's what I got from that. All right. On the 18-pounder, question is, how did it get to the Alamo? We know where it was made now. So how did it actually get here? And then where did it disappear to? Do you have a sense of where to look for it?
We're still looking for that answer. Yeah. If the city's kind enough to let us look a little further in that park, I think that's where it might be. But the cannon comes in on a sloop into Matagorda Bay. They're trying to get it here for the siege and Battle of Bihar, but of course it's too late. Stephen F. Austin is requesting this cannon. The Texas provincial government is saying he doesn't really need it. It's not that big of a deal. And then all of a sudden, it is a big deal, and they need to get it here.
Unfortunately for them, the ship captain becomes drunk and runs the ship onto a sandbar. And so they have to bring another ship out, offload the cannon, and they bring it onto the docks, and they realize they forgot all the ammunition for it in New Orleans. And so it's kind of it's a little bit of a difficulty trying to get the gun into Texas. And then it sits on the dock there for a while. And then through our research and a few other individuals that helped us along, we found a handbill from a man named John Little, who was paid $20 to make wheels for that cannon. So it arrives here with a carriage that was suitable for a ship that has tiny wheels to fit in the hold of a ship. And the issue there is if you've ever pulled anything over rocky Texas soil, that cannon carriage won't do well. So they had to make special wheels for it, very large ones, and they put it onto the back of a cotton wagon, and they carried it up here. And the people carrying it and leading it here would be 2 New Orleans Grays, who were a militia unit during the Texas Revolution, and it arrives here into the Alamo without a proper carriage, but brand new wheels. So they would have taken whatever they had, and they would have put it together, and they would have made a Frankenstein-esque cannon carriage for this gun, which, yeah, this is pretty interesting to see the steps it takes to get a cannon across Texas. So.
Yeah, serious logistics.
Yeah.
Great. I'm going to switch over to, anyone have a follow-up on that? Anyone? Thumb up? Pardon? What happened to the kid? Don't know.
Oh,
that's a mystery, right?
That's the last part of the question that was asked. That cannon disappears in 1917. There's some ideas that maybe it was used during a World War I drive to melt down and make other pieces of armament. I don't know, through our research, I don't know if I believe that. We can't find any evidence of any actual big drives here in San Antonio. What we did find is that there is a man named Mr. Mink. He owned San Pedro Springs Park, and he owned the first zoo in San Antonio. And then the Ringling brothers, Barnum and Bailey, their head zoo master came and bought all the animals, and we found the handbill in the city archives that says that he bought all the animals, curios, and relics. So we don't know if the cannon disappears from there, but Mr. Mink had brought his nephew from Germany, and he was a blacksmith. And we think that maybe when the park was sold, that cannon was pulled off of its plinth in the park and maybe melted down and made into something else. My coworker, Ernesto Rodriguez, and I were digging further, and we found that Mr. Mink's house is still there in San Pedro Springs Park. And so Ernesto and I went, and we saw the house, and they had a large amount of iron scrap in the backyard, and it's very possible that cannon could be in the backyard of that home. We've seen that before with a smaller swivel gun, a small 90-pound cannon that was being used to hold up a bird fountain in someone's backyard. So it's very possible. And yeah, Ernesto was kind enough to drop me off there, lock the truck and say good luck, and I went and knocked on the door, but we never got an answer. So yeah, it could be that it is still in that park in a ditch that was maybe shoved over there, or that it was scrapped in a World War I drive. We just don't know. More research to be done.
Thank you for that. It's awesome. Okay, Don. First one's about supplies. So a question about what type of supplies came through the Alamo and where do they originate from? And I realize there's going to be a lot, so maybe just like what were the main ones and kind of what was
Wait, I've got a list of everything that passed through.
Right. And we'll all see you in the morning.
Just think of an Ace Hardware store in any town in Texas. And whatever's back in the fittings and hardware section of that store is what's coming through here. Because armies have a lot of moving parts. And sometimes it's things as mundane as a hinge that you can't get manufactured locally, or some sort of screw, some sort of nut and bolt, something like that has to come from somewhere. And you think, well, there's probably somebody down the street just hammering this stuff out. Well, not exactly, because they're got to be machined to certain specifications if you're going to use them with certain weapon systems, etc. So a bunch of the items that come to the Alamo are extraordinarily common and not particularly interesting looking, but they were born in some manufacturing facility, probably in New York or New England, and carried by ship to Indianola on Matagorda Bay. And then they're transferred into warehouses there, and then when they get a load up, they put them in the wagons and haul them up to San Antonio. And so you need to think of the way that armies move, the logistics behind the movement of men and animals and equipment. Commissary is food. That's the chow. Quartermaster is the gear. Ordinance is the stuff that goes boom, okay? This is really a quartermaster depot. It's the hardware store. And it's really pretty simple stuff, but a lot of it. And it wears out. I mean, then you get into things like shoes and strapping and belting and that sort of thing.
And is anything being made other than in the U.S. at this point that you think that's coming through? Is there some international suppliers?
Well, it's all about the government contract system.
Sure.
All right, and so, you've got people that are doing government contracts, and so you've got big arsenal centers and manufacturing centers, especially in New England and in the Hudson River Valley. So most of this is going to be domestic goods, and it's going to be pretty, well, it's just stuff that you can make a whole bunch of. So you don't need to let a contract to, say, a British manufacturing agent for elevation screws. You just don't. I mean, we can do that. So by that time, the Industrial Revolution is up and running in the United States. We've already stolen the steam engine designs from the British. We stole it fair and square. And now all of a sudden the United States is up and running as an industrial power. Who says China's the only people that can steal technology? We were good at it first. All right. So we're turning all this stuff out, and it's just a supply chain. And there's a regular boat operation that's running between Indianola and New York City and Boston. That's cranking this gear down. Now, we'll point out that during the U.S.-Mexican War, Congress decided that they needed to trim some of the budget right on the edge of the conflict. And so they went from issuing two different pattern uniforms, a winter weight and a summer weight uniform. And they said, you can only have one weight of uniform. So right before the Mexican War, they said, well, then we'll just give them the winter weight. So they sent a lot of wool through Indianola to San Antonio, and the guy said, oh, gee whiz, thanks. And I got rid of the cotton uniform. So.
Right on. Thank you.
Yeah.
And a second question for you. What was the impact of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo have on this area?
Transformational. I mean, it is essentially the recreation of this area. You think about Texas prior to that event, and it was always kind of the back lot. It was the outback to the Spanish Empire. It was the far away La Frontera for the Mexican Republic, and it was a problem because you couldn't control it. You couldn't patrol it. You couldn't convince people to go up there and occupy it, and it was occupied as a result by an indigenous empire, the Comanches. So for the Spanish, it was a problem. It was a way for the French to sneak in at first, and then it just became more and more of an administrative headache. For Mexico, it was a headache they inherited, and then all of a sudden, it's no longer their headache. It's an American headache. And I was reading a letter of a Confederate soldier that was marching through New Mexico. And he's walking through the desert Southwest, and he's looking around, and he's enlisted from some farm near Nacogdoches where it's pretty green, big trees and stuff. And man, he's going up the Rio Grande Valley, and he says, you know what? New Mexico is the best trick old Mexico ever played on the United States, making us take this dump. All right. So what ends up happening, though, is you have this sort of new orientation. It is the border has now moved south. The problems that had plagued the previous owners are no longer their problem. It's now an American problem. But it absolutely charts the course for the next 20 years. And I would argue that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo sets the stage for two revolutions, two civil wars. One is La Guerra de la Reforma in Mexico and the American Civil War, primarily because you have all sorts of territorial issues and who's getting paid and who lost this and recrimination south of the Rio Bravo del Norte. North of the Rio Grande, you've got all sorts of people talking about, well, is this going to be free or slave territory, exacerbating those national rifts. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo lights the fuse that leads to two civil wars, a French intervention south of the border, an American intervention that ends the French intervention. It is absolutely phenomenal. Now, you asked a big question here, clearly, and I'm a historian with a microphone.
Cut him off.
But yeah, kind of where's the hook? But then, that's not even considering what happens to the indigenous peoples. Because for generations, these guys have been going down and essentially using Chihuahua, Durango, Coahuila as their commissary. And the Comanches have made this huge empire out of stealing Mexican horses and kids. And they are trafficking kids from out of Mexico and turning them into new Comanches. And then all of a sudden, the border has shifted, and the Americans show up and say, you guys can't do that anymore. That is no longer allowed. And the Comanches are perplexed, going, well, you guys were shooting at them just a couple of years ago. How come we can't still shoot at them? And all of a sudden, those sorts of relations have to get reoriented. It's very interesting to me when you look at the different painted teepees that are chronicles of different indigenous peoples, especially like the Kiowa. How many Mexican uniforms are in those battle scenes? And we forget how much action there is between the indigenous peoples north of the Rio Grande and the people that are trying to protect the frontera of what is left of Mexico after Guadalupe Hidalgo. So it is the absolute most transformational event of the mid-19th century that just completely reorients the world.
Oh, thank you for that.
Sure.
Strikes me just even hearing today, and I've heard in the past, like reference to the Comanches and the Apaches, and of course a lot of other indigenous tribes, like literally having representatives from those communities come. Like, I'd be really interested, like, what's their perspective? Like, how is this all like laying on them? So it just really heightens that. Like, as you're telling those stories, like, wow, all right, there's more stories to be learned, and incorporated. I know that that's what we're all trying to do together. Do we have any more time for our question, or are we? Yeah. For me, I was struck by the quote you had from Olmsted.
Yeah.
And in what struck me, I just sort of took away this basic idea of, like, there's seems to be in that moment for him indifference, right? He's looking at something and like, man, this place is kind of a dump, right? It's fallen apart. No one cares. It's rusted. The stucco's fallen off. And he's also, right, saying it is a monument, right, to courage. So one is kind of interesting. Like, how did he know that? Like, how the heck? I mean, he couldn't come out there with himself. He didn't walk around like, this place is a dump. It must be a monument, right? It's like that wasn't his thing. So how did he get that? But then also, and this is for really the whole panel. I'm really curious about how you guys look at that period of time that you just described, and how was the Alamo as an object itself, right? How does it live in both worlds, where there's this sort of indifference to it, or it's just this functional thing? It's a quartermaster place. Like, I get some screws and bolts going through it, but we also have people going, like, this is a place that I cherish. It's a part of, like, it's the center of, the American experience, or the Texas, So I'm just curious if you guys can sort of talk a little bit about that, like, conundrum, that contrast of those two things coexisting.
I'll start a little bit, because John and I were chatting about it sort of off to the side, or right before this started, and to me it goes back a little bit to what's the purpose of a mission, and the purpose of a mission was to become a settlement, and so you look at the first thought, you look at the Alamo, even you look at it in the 1850s, or you even look at it today, and you think, oh, well, it's kind of a dump. But there's not much left of it. How successful could it be? It didn't even get a roof on the church. And but then you actually look at it and you say, but wait, it's the center. It actually is the most successful mission, because it's the center not only of San Antonio, the 7th largest city in the United States, but as Don was saying, it's the center of this whole South Texas new community that we had. So yeah, you look like at one side and say, oh, well, it's a dump, but it's fulfilled its purpose. It's been used and reused and continues to be the center regardless of what stage of building construction it's in or what pattern it is. It remains that monument to its beginnings and its future.
Yeah, I look at the Alamo in the time that I've been here, and I've seen, hundreds of thousands of people come through our doors, and I think the Alamo is so many different things for so many different people, but it's a perfect example of adaptive reuse. It truly is. The landscape changes, the people change, people come, they go, but the building is always there. And you can look throughout history, important crossroads are constantly fought over. People are trying to claim it as theirs or this or that. And San Antonio just happens to be one of the most conquered cities in the United States. And so I think the Alamo, it survives because of its location, but not only that, it becomes a place where people find safety, they find commercialism. And so I think the Alamo is it's that perfect example of, for some people maybe money, but other people it's safety and it's a history, and it brings out, I think, the best in some people, and it's kind of neat. It's a really neat portion of Texas history. And
well, and Frederick Law Olmsted's coming from New York City, and it's 20 years after the battle. So what does he know about this pile? And he mentions, this is not about faith, this was about courage. So where did he get those words? How come he used those words? Why didn't he say this was about house cats and, litmus paper? Why those particular parts of the English language? Faith and courage. And I think that part of that is because the Alamo was effectively sold in circles back east, contemporary to the battle. And when I say sold, think about what had to happen for that revolution to occur and to be sustained. You got to fund it. And so how are you going to fund something? If you're trying to sell a car, you don't say, well, this car's missing on one cylinder and the back door doesn't actually catch, but it's a great car. No, you're saying, man, this thing is a rocket and it's a great vehicle and you're really going to talk it up. So if you're trying to really press your case for funding, for why people need to turn loose of their money, invest in what's happening in Texas, you have to make a compelling argument. And that compelling argument is, these guys, they held up at this post. We could debate for days. We're currently debating out there in Big White Alamo land over whether or not they were, suckers for staying there or brave for staying there. Not even going to really discuss that part. But it's about selling this vision, this idea, that some things are worth doing. And it's going to take people backing our play to make this happen. Doesn't matter if you're a federalist who doesn't like despotism. It doesn't matter if you're an aspiring landowner or somebody who wants to move a plantation to Texas. You have to have some sort of compelling reason to do what you're doing. And that compelling reason is about courage instead of faith. And that message, 20 years on, is in common circulation. I mean, Olmsted's no idiot. He's read a book or two and probably watched CNN. But it was so common that when he saw this really government office complex, he said, it wasn't about faith, it was about courage.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We're all good. Thank you.
Great. It was a great way to end out the panel discussion, to be able to get each one of your perspectives and opinions that way. So thank you all for all the great questions, participation. Thank you all for being here. And for some closing comments, I wanted to invite our ACAC Tri-Chair member Rebecca Villagran up to the podium to say a couple closing comments.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much to our panelists, Dr. Frazier, Colby, Susan. Great to see you all. Thank you so much for sharing the information today. I'd also like to thank all of the ACAC members who are part of the planning committee for today, Fort Alamo. Once again, I think our content discussions are demonstrating the different layers and the different sagas that are part of our Alamo Mission de Valero story here, and we're getting that each and every time. We want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we want to make sure that everyone is invited to participate and to join us again at our next content discussion, which is Tuesday, August 10th, starting at 5:30 p.m. on the City of San Antonio's YouTube channel. The topic is Who's Who, Where, and When. And so I'm looking forward to that, and thank you to all the planning committee members. That will be live streamed on our YouTube channel. And a reminder that all of our other content discussions that we've had since the beginning, since April, that they are all on the city's YouTube channel. So you can review them, you can go through them, and you can relive all of the fantastic stories, which we'll be doing with your presentations as well. Again, thank you all very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.